Okay, let's go. Number 10. The Apollo 10 Floating Poop Incident, May 1969. Three astronauts, Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan, are on the Apollo 10 mission, the full dress rehearsal for the moon landing. They are among the most highly trained human beings on the planet. They are 2 months away from one of the greatest achievements in human history. And then, floating silently through their spacecraft cabin, comes something none of them put there: a rogue piece of human waste. This is not a rumor. This is in the actual mission transcript, declassified, publicly available, sitting in NASA's own archives. The exchange goes something like this. One of the crew notices something floating. Someone asks what it is. Someone else, very calmly, says it's a turd. What follows is a brief, deeply human argument about whose it is, with all three astronauts insisting it did not come from them. Now, why does this matter beyond being the funniest thing in NASA's history? Because it perfectly captures what nobody tells you about spaceflight. You prepare for every conceivable technical failure. You train for emergencies, system malfunctions, orbital calculations. You do not spend enough time preparing for the fact that in zero gravity, waste management is genuinely, seriously, one of the most complicated and uncomfortable parts of the job. The Apollo missions used a system that, to put it diplomatically, was far from foolproof. Waste bags, in a capsule, with 3 people, in zero gravity. The math was always going to catch up with someone eventually. What makes this story unforgettable is exactly that combination of the absurd and the real. These were heroes. They were days away from making history. And somewhere between the moon and the Earth, they had to deal with a floating problem that no amount of astronaut training had quite prepared them for. Space is humbling like that. Number 9. Space smelled like burnt steak. Here is something that will permanently change the way you think about space. It has a smell. Not inside the spacecraft. Inside is recycled air and metal and that particular sterile scent you'd expect. I mean, space itself, or at least, what astronauts encounter the moment they come back in from a spacewalk. Multiple astronauts, across multiple missions spanning decades, have described the exact same thing. The moment the airlock seals and they take off their helmets, there's a smell clinging to their suits that doesn't belong. It's been described as burnt steak, hot metal, the smell after you've been welding, gunpowder, seared meat. Don Pettit, a NASA astronaut who's spent over 6 months on the International Space Station, has talked about it directly. He described it as a mix of metal and something charred, and the smell was consistent enough that he and other crew members noticed it every single time after a spacewalk. Think about that for a second. We are talking about a vacuum, a place with no air, no atmosphere, no molecules to carry any scent whatsoever. By every law of physics, space should have no smell at all. You should come back in through that airlock and smell absolutely nothing unusual. Instead, astronauts come back in smelling like someone left a steak on a grill too long or walked past a welding shop. The leading scientific explanation involves polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, complex carbon-based molecules floating in the thin regions of space that could cling to suit material during an EVA. Some researchers have linked it to dying stars, which release these compounds as they burn out. But here's what hits differently. Somewhere out in the void, something is burning, and astronauts are bringing that smell back with them, clinging to their gloves, embedded in the seams of their suits. Every time they come back through that airlock, they carry just a trace of something ancient and enormous and incomprehensible back with them. Space smells like death and fire, and nobody tells you that. Number 8. Astronauts saw flashes with their eyes closed. Imagine you're trying to sleep in space. The cabin is dark. Your crewmates are quiet. You close your eyes, and then your own vision starts flashing. Not from outside, not from a light somewhere, from inside your head, in the dark, with your eyes completely shut. This is not a story. This is something that has happened to dozens of astronauts, going all the way back to the Apollo missions in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Astronauts reported seeing random flashes of light, streaks, bursts, sometimes branching shapes like lightning, with their eyes closed. Happening unpredictably, without warning, in the dark. The first reports baffled scientists enough that NASA eventually ran dedicated experiments to study it. The answer, once they found it, is almost more unsettling than the mystery. Cosmic rays. Space is filled with high-energy particles traveling at near the speed of light, leftovers from ancient supernovae, shot across the galaxy over billions of years. On Earth, our planet's magnetic field and atmosphere absorb almost all of them. In low Earth orbit, and especially beyond it, astronauts are exposed to a constant stream of these particles. When a cosmic ray passes through an astronaut's skull, it doesn't slow down. It cuts straight through, and as it does, it interacts directly with the cells of the retina or the optic nerve. The interaction produces a flash of light that the brain registers as real, because to the visual system, it essentially is. You are not imagining it. You are not hallucinating. A particle that has been traveling across the galaxy for longer than the Earth has existed just passed through your head and lit up your vision. Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin reported the flashes. So did many of the Apollo crew members that followed. Astronauts on long-duration missions to the space station report them regularly. And research has shown that over time, the accumulated exposure to these particles causes measurable changes in vision. Some astronauts return from long missions with permanently altered eyesight. Something ancient is passing through you. You can see it happening, and there is nothing you can do about it. Number 7. A tear can turn into a real problem. If you cried right now, a tear would roll down your cheek. Gravity handles the whole thing automatically. Your cheek, your chin, gravity, done. In space, that doesn't happen. Astronaut Chris Hadfield, one of the most experienced astronauts in history, commander of the International Space Station, a person who has spent months living in microgravity, has demonstrated and described this in detail. When you cry in space, the tear doesn't fall. It clings. Surface tension holds it to your eye, and as more moisture accumulates, the blob grows. It expands across your eye. It spreads. Eventually, it covers your entire eye and starts creeping toward the other one, and you cannot see. But the version of this story that crosses from strange into genuinely frightening happened during a spacewalk. In 2013, during an EVA outside the ISS, Hadfield's left eye began to water. A cleaning solution used inside the helmet had irritated it. Not unusual, not dangerous under normal circumstances. But in the closed environment of a spacesuit helmet, the liquid had nowhere to go. It pooled over his eye. Then it spread. Within minutes, both eyes were affected, and he was, for all practical purposes, blind. He was outside the space station, in a spacesuit, floating in the vacuum of space, and he could not see. The only option was to keep the airlock in mind, stay calm, and wait for the moisture to slowly reabsorb into the tissues around his eyes, which it eventually did. He made it back safely. But take a moment with that image. One of the most experienced spacewalkers in history, tethered to the outside of a structure orbiting Earth at 17,500 miles per hour, temporarily blinded by a tear that had nowhere to go. Something as small and human as a watering eye becomes a survival situation the moment you leave the atmosphere. Number 6. A Chinese astronaut heard knocking on his capsule. October 2003. Yang Liwei is the first Chinese person to travel to space. He is alone in the Shenzhou 5 capsule, orbiting Earth on a mission that lasts just under a day. He is doing his country proud. He is making history. And then he hears knocking. Not from inside the capsule, from outside. A rhythmic tapping sound, like someone striking the hull from the other side. He described it as similar to someone hitting an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. Not random, not a creak or a groan from the spacecraft structure, a knock. He looked out the window. He saw nothing. He searched for any instrument that could explain it. Nothing gave him an answer. The sound happened multiple times during the mission, and it didn't come with any other indication of a problem. No pressure change, no alarm, no mechanical fault, just the sound from outside in a place where there was nothing. Yang Liwei has talked about this publicly. He was clearly shaken by it enough that he went back to try to recreate the sound after returning to Earth, knocking on different surfaces and materials to find something that matched what he heard. He never found a perfect match. Chinese space authorities eventually offered an explanation. The extreme temperature differences between the sunlit and shadowed sides of the capsule as it orbited caused the structure to contract and expand slightly, producing sounds. It's a reasonable engineering explanation, and maybe it's correct. But here's what stays with you. Yang Liwei was completely alone. The nearest human being was 60 miles below him, and something outside his capsule, in a vacuum, in the dark, where nothing should be, sounded like it was knocking to come in. Some sounds you don't forget, no matter how logical the explanation turns out to be. Number 5. A giant urine icicle formed on a space shuttle. The Space Shuttle program is a marvel of human engineering. Millions of components, decades of testing, some of the most brilliant aerospace minds in history working on every possible contingency. Nobody planned for the urine icicle. During one of the early shuttle missions, a problem developed with how wastewater was being managed and expelled from the orbiter. The system that was supposed to handle liquid waste, including, yes, urine, developed a blockage or a leak, and rather than being vented cleanly away, the liquid accumulated on the outer hull of the spacecraft and froze. In the temperature of space, where surfaces in shadow can drop to -250 degrees Fahrenheit, liquid freezes fast. What built up on the outside of the shuttle was a significant mass of ice, an ice formation that engineers reviewing the mission later explicitly described in NASA oral history material as a urine icicle. It wasn't just disgusting, it was a genuine engineering problem. Ice buildup on a spacecraft is a physical hazard. It adds mass in the wrong place, it can interfere with thermal protection, and when the shuttle re-entered the atmosphere, the behavior of that ice was a real concern. Engineers had to evaluate whether it could break off and cause damage during re-entry, the same kind of damage that would become catastrophically relevant with the Columbia disaster years later. So, NASA had to spend time and resources assessing the structural risk posed by a frozen accumulation of astronaut waste on the outside of a multi-billion-dollar spacecraft. This is the part of the space program that doesn't make it into the inspirational documentaries. The sublime and the absurd exist in exactly equal measure up there. For every moment of awe looking at the curvature of the Earth, there's an engineer on the ground doing the math on a urine icicle. That's the job. That's actually the job. Number 4. Apollo 10 heard music behind the moon. May 1969. Apollo 10, again. The same crew, Stafford, Young, Cernan, who gave us the floating waste incident at number 10. They were already living an extremely eventful mission. But this one is different. This one is genuinely eerie. When their spacecraft passed behind the moon, they lost all contact with Earth. That's expected. The moon's bulk blocks every radio frequency, and for roughly an hour, the crew was completely isolated. No communication with mission control. No signals in or out. Just them, the capsule, and the silent far side of a world 238,000 miles from home. And then they heard music. Not singing. A whistling, ethereal, almost melodic sound. Something they described in the mission transcripts as outer space-type music. It was picked up by their radio equipment. It didn't sound like static or interference. It sounded like something. The transcripts of this conversation were kept out of public circulation for years, not classified exactly, but not widely publicized either. When they were finally released and reported on, the crew members gave interviews talking about how unsettling the experience had been. Gene Cernan, in particular, said that at the time they genuinely didn't know what to make of it, and they debated whether they should even tell NASA about it, worried about how it would sound. The explanation, when scientists looked into it, involves radio interference. Specifically, the VHF radios used in the two spacecraft modules interacting with each other and producing a whistling tone. It's a coherent technical explanation, and maybe it is what happened. Whatever the explanation, that sound was real. They heard it, and none of them ever quite forgot it. Number 3. A space capsule was swarmed by floating lights. February 20th, 1962. John Glenn is in orbit aboard Friendship 7, the first American to circle the Earth. He's already making history. The whole country is watching from below, and then he looks out the window. And space is full of fireflies. That's the word he used. Thousands, he estimated thousands, of tiny glowing particles surrounding his capsule. Not distant stars, not reflections. Tiny bright objects right outside his window, drifting and sparkling as if lit from within, moving slowly, floating alongside him as he orbited at 17,000 miles per hour. He tapped the side of the capsule and more of them appeared. He radioed mission control. They had no idea what he was describing. Nothing like this had been reported before. No instrument could detect what he was seeing. Glenn watched them for a significant portion of his first orbit, genuinely uncertain what he was witnessing. He described them as beautiful, and then, just as unexpectedly as they appeared, they drifted away. NASA eventually concluded they were ice crystals, tiny particles of condensation or frost shaken loose from the capsule's exterior, catching sunlight at the right angle to glow. It's a sensible explanation, and it makes sense, but we will never know for sure. Number 2. A cargo ship slammed into the space station. June 25th, 1997. The Russian space station Mir is aging, underfunded, and struggling with a series of cascading technical problems that have made it one of the most stressful environments any human beings have ever lived in. Cosmonauts Vasily Tsiblyev and Alexander Lazutkin, along with NASA astronaut Michael Foale, are trying to keep the station operational under conditions that would have grounded a mission years earlier. And then a cargo ship hits them. A Progress resupply craft, an unmanned vehicle meant to dock automatically and deliver supplies, was being tested under manual remote control as part of an experiment to develop a cheaper docking method. The test went wrong. The Progress came in too fast, at the wrong angle, and struck the Spectre module of Mir directly. The impact ruptured the hull of the Spectre module. Air began escaping. The station went into an uncontrolled tumble. Power systems failed as the solar panels lost their alignment with the sun. The crew had minutes to seal off the damaged module before the entire station depressurized. They made it. They sealed the hatch. But Mir was crippled. The station lost a significant portion of its power-generating capacity. The crew had to live for weeks in a severely degraded station, floating in partial darkness, performing makeshift repairs, cutting cables to seal off the damaged section, while mission control in Russia and NASA scrambled to figure out what to do. Michael Foale later described the sound of the collision and the immediate chaos that followed in detail. He described watching the porthole and seeing the station slowly spinning against the stars, realizing they were tumbling, and understanding immediately that this was the kind of situation from which Mir might not recover. This actually happened. A manned space station was rammed by a cargo ship, partially depressurized, and lost control. 3 people were inside. The station survived. They all came home. Somehow, this story is not nearly as famous as it should be. Number 1. The Cosmonauts Who Saw Angels, July 1985. The Soviet space station Salyut 7 has been in orbit for 3 years. The crew, cosmonauts Oleg Atkov, Vladimir Solovyov, and Leonid Kizim, are deep into a record-breaking long-duration mission. They are experienced, they are professional, they are not the kind of people who say things they can't back up. On day 155 of their mission, the station is bathed in an intense orange light, not an instrument malfunction, not a reflection, a light that seems to come from everywhere at once, flooding every window of the station simultaneously. They look outside, and there, floating alongside the station in the vacuum of open space, are 7 figures. Not shapes, not lights. Figures. Enormous ones. The cosmonauts estimated their wingspans at roughly the size of a jumbo jet. Humanoid in form, but vast, with wings, faces, and according to every account that emerged from this mission, they were smiling. The 3 cosmonauts stared at these figures for approximately 10 minutes. Then, they were gone. Now, here is the part that makes this impossible to dismiss quite as easily as you'd like to. 10 days later, 3 more cosmonauts arrived at Salyut 7 on a resupply mission. Svetlana Savitskaya, Igor Volk, and Vladimir Janibakov. 6 people now on the station. Fresh eyes. No knowledge of what the first crew had seen. The orange light came back. All 6 cosmonauts gathered at the windows, and all 6 of them saw the same figures, the same enormous winged forms, the same faces, the same expressions. 6 trained Soviet military cosmonauts across 2 completely separate sightings, describing the same thing in independent accounts. The Soviet government suppressed the reports for years, as they suppressed almost everything unusual from their space program. The accounts emerged in fragments over the following decades, through interviews, through documents that surfaced after the Soviet Union collapsed, through the cosmonauts themselves speaking in later years. The details are consistent across all of them. There is no agreed-upon scientific explanation. Suggestions have included mass hallucination brought on by extreme stress and long-duration spaceflight, though the consistency of the accounts across 2 separate crews makes that harder to sustain. Some researchers have pointed to the effects of high radiation environments on human visual and neurological processing, the same phenomenon we talked about with cosmic ray flashes, potentially amplified to an extreme degree. Others have no explanation at all. What we know for certain is this. 6 cosmonauts in 2 separate incidents on a Soviet space station in 1985 reported seeing enormous winged humanoid figures outside their windows. They filed reports. The government buried those reports. The cosmonauts stood by their accounts. Every other story on this list has a rational explanation. The floating waste, the icicle, the knocking capsule, the fireflies, the music, Science has answered all of them more or less. This one doesn't have an answer. 6 people saw something. Nobody has ever fully explained what it was. And if you asked any one of those cosmonauts directly, those who are still alive, those who have spoken publicly, not one of them has ever walked their account back. They saw what they saw. Make of that what you will. That's it for today. Subscribe for more.